Okay, we're back from lunch. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our afternoon keynote speaker, Dr. David Vago. Dr. Vago is an associate psychologist in the Functional Neuroimaging Lab at Brigham and Women's Hospital, who also teaches at Harvard Medical School. He has completed postdoctoral fellowships in the Department of Psychiatry at Brigham and Women's, the University of Utah Center for Mind-Body Interactions, and the Stuart T. Hauser Research Training Program in Biological and Social Psychiatry. David received his bachelor's degree in Brain and Cognitive Sciences in 1997 from the University of Rochester, and his Ph.D. in Cognitive and Neurosciences with a specialization in learning and memory from the University of Utah in 2005. David has previously held the position of Senior Research Coordinator for the Mind and Life Institute and is currently a Mind and Life Fellow, supporting the Mind and Life mission by advising on strategy and programs. Mind and Life is committed to building a scientific understanding of the mind as a way to help reduce suffering and promote human flourishing by fostering interdisciplinary dialogue between Western science, philosophy, the humanities, and contemplative traditions. Mind and Life supports the integration of first-person inquiry through meditation and other contemplative practices into traditional scientific methodology. Since its inception 30 years ago, Mind and Life has become a leader in the field of contemplative science. David's research interests broadly focus on utilizing translational models to identify and characterize neurobiological substrates to mediate psychopathology, to better predict outcomes and potential biologically based diagnostic and therapeutic strategies for those suffering with mental illness. He aims to clarify adaptive mind-brain-body interactions and their therapeutic relevance in psychiatric settings. In this context, David focuses on the study of mindfulness-based interventions in clinical settings and the basic cognitive and neuroscientific mechanisms by which mindfulness-based practices function. He has twice presented this groundbreaking work to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. His address today, entitled Neuroscientific Assessment of the Impact of Mindfulness on Brain Functioning, is sure to be enlightening. And with that, let's offer a warm welcome to Dr. David Vago.
Thank you so much to Lisa. Really, I know what it takes to organize a conference of this magnitude, and it's not a simple feat. So thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all the organizers really for making this come to fruition. Just looking around, you get the sense of how important this field is for everyone in the field of education and clinical science. And so it's just so wonderful to be here, allowing me to share space with you all. I do hope to focus a lot on where I have expertise, and that really starts with the fact that I've been a practitioner for I think around 20 years now. When I was an undergrad at the University of Rochester, right down the road, I was inspired by a class called Asian Search for Self by Professor Douglas Brooks, for those of you who know him. But I went to a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat right after that course and did my own searching. And really it has impacted everything that I've done since then. My science has been completely transformed because of that. So the practice certainly is so important, and the experiential component is so important, as we've all trying to understand. So I really want to emphasize that really, as scientists, clinicians, and educators in this emerging field of contemplative science, in this inner revolution, as Daniel was nicely trying to emphasize, we are slowly approaching a level of precision in our theoretical and mechanistic account of mindfulness and the associated contemplative practices. And the field has grown tremendously in the last decade, tremendously. And I should show you, let's see if I can get this going here. In the past decade, there's been a lot of progress, but the science is in its infancy, of course. And I want to emphasize how much infancy we are at. Even though, when you look at graphs like this, you see how there's been an explosion of work And there's clearly a lot of data. There's over 5,000 articles that have either meditation, mindfulness, or yoga in their keyword or abstract as of recently. And to accompany this, there's been the same amount of hype in the popular press. And what we need to be really careful about is taking the things that we read in the popular press as the science. Because, as I will continue to emphasize, we are really in the beginning stages of trying to understand mechanism and understand how these practices work. You know, what's the appropriate context in which we bring these practices into a particular setting? You know, what is the appropriate population? And so these are the types of questions that we really have to continue to answer. And it is therefore really up to us, okay, everyone here, to do the rigorous research necessary, right? We are the ones that are going to do this research that's really critical to allowing us to sustain this field of investigation and to allow us to provide the insight. What is the most appropriate context in which to do these practices? And what's the most appropriate populations in which these practices are going to show some benefit? So I'd like to always start with, and I'm going to really paint broad strokes here because there's a lot of great research that's being talked about here. So if it seems too broad, I'm sorry, but I'd like to contextualize things from not only a sort of societal point of view, where we stand, but also even from an evolutionary point of view. So I'll be dabbling a little bit into paleoneurology and evolution. But we start really with the Maharishi on the cover of Time magazine in 1975. And really, I like to use these images because Time magazine sort of gives us a nice metric for what is influencing pop culture. And in the 1970s, certainly transcendental meditation made its sort of introduction into mainstream society. The Beatles, went to Rishikesh. They met the Maharishi. They were convinced that mantra meditation, specifically transcendental meditation, will save their souls and give them enlightenment. And now a lot of the Hollywood population is still using TM. But they had a falling out really in the scientific domain in the late 70s. And there was just a really big gap of time that passed in which it fell to the wayside and wasn't considered real research. But I think one indicator that meditation is being considered seriously now is that the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine at the NIH has changed their name to reflect where we stand really with integrative health and integrative medicine. And it's now called National Center for Complementary and Integrative Medicine. There's no alternative. This is no longer an alternative to good medicine. It just is good medicine. We have to just start believing that and practicing that. So, 2003, we have the science of meditation, and in 2014, we're in the midst of a mindful revolution. But clearly, you have to be a good-looking blonde to experience the bliss of mindfulness. Science has certainly also reflected this revolution. In 2008 was the first time the Buddha appeared on a top-tier scientific journal. Okay, that was huge, Trends in Cognitive Sciences. And that was done by a group from Richie Davidson's lab. And really, Richie's lab has been a pioneer in this field. He's been inspiration for many people like myself. And then in 2010, you have a journal that's dedicated to just mindfulness research. And just last year, the highest impact paper came out in Nature Reviews Neuroscience by some colleagues of mine, Yuan Tang and Berta Holzel, talking about sort of where we stand on how does meditation affect the brain and different forms of meditation, very specific forms of meditation that I'll get into. Mindfulness is, of course, selling millions of books by prominent societal figures. It's a huge multi-million-dollar industry now. You see it everywhere. And there's all different types of books talking about mindfulness. Of course, there's the most important book is Mindfulness for Dummies. So, you really have no clue. Like I said, I'm going to try to paint broad strokes to provide sort of foundation for what everyone's presenting here today. And I really just hope to contextualize mindfulness. So provide examples of the theoretical models we have proposed to capture the cognitive and neurobiological changes associated with what we think of as self-transformation. Discuss some of the important brain networks and how we think they are being recruited and supporting very core mindfulness-based practices. So I'll talk specifically about what practice we think fit into the core models or core meditation practices that would be mindfulness-based, and what are the brain systems that are supporting those practices. I'll talk about the salient points in the neuroimaging research, because I don't have all day. I could talk to you all day about it, but I will make sure that it's very clear. So if you don't have any neuroscience background, I give you nice colored pictures with, that are color coded, so you can understand exactly what's going on in your brain. You can just go home saying, "Oh, I know that the green network is on right here." And then we'll talk about some summary take-home messages. And really, I want to talk a little bit I want to be a little reflective about where we came from. Where have we come from with the science of meditation, and where are we going? What's the next, steps for this science? So the way I start usually contextualizing mindfulness is with this 2,500-year-old model and about 37-year-old model by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who's a molecular biologist by training. Got his Ph.D. in 1971 from MIT. So in 1979, he started bringing in, he had his own meditation practice, and he started to see some benefit in trying to take some of the practices that he was doing in more in a sort of a spiritual tradition, and put them into a context that was more secular, or he hates that word, by the way, but in a context at least that most people wouldn't see as religious, in a way that would actually benefit people. Because this really isn't owned by Buddhism, as Daniel was suggesting. These are not practices that are owned by anybody. The fact that we want to just encourage this sort of connection with humans, this is just a natural type of phenomenon. This is just what's good for humanity. So nobody owns mindfulness, as I think someone pointed out, and that's what I want to emphasize. But we do have to put these two models side by side. The goals, the context, the content, the processes that you deliver these types of practices in is very important. If you are doing this in a cave out in the Himalayas, your goal may be enlightenment. Okay, that's very different from a businessman who wants to practice a little bit to reduce their stress and get ahead. But he's still doing the same practices, and that's where we focus on the common threads between the two models. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Let's just start with, what is meditation? And meditation is actually an English word, and it comes from the Sanskrit bhavana, and bhavana just means causing to become, or cultivation, right? Or the development of familiarity. And really, what this is reflecting is your own cultivation of familiarity with your own mind, with your own mental landscape. What's going on in your own mind? There was a panel right before before lunch, referred to as self-care. But really, self-reflection is where we're really starting. This inner sort of reflection. Daniel also pointed to this. So that's really where meditation begins, is just cultivating familiarity with your own mind. What is it doing when it's doing nothing, for example? So let's just talk about the Buddhist perspective and how it contextualizes mindfulness first. It thinks of mindfulness as a mental factor, okay, or a skill. Okay, and in this context, I like to use, and I'll have to step out here. I like to use this picture of a Thangka painting. It's one of my favorite depictions of the progress of a practitioner. And it goes along these stages of development. This is the 9 stages of shamatha. Shamatha meaning settling the mind, taming the mind. It's done very specifically in a focused attention meditation practice. Okay? So let me just walk you through this. You have I wonder if this has a laser beam thing. Yeah, okay. So you've got a practitioner here, and he's chasing the elephant. And the elephant represents the mind. There's an untamed The mind is supposedly causes a lot of destructive types of thinking and emotions, just like an untamed elephant may also wreak havoc and cause destruction. The elephant is being led by a monkey. The monkey represents distraction. Okay? You've heard of monkey mind. This is when your mind is leaping from one thought to another and over again. Probably most of us are familiar with this. We end up doing this about half of our lives. The darkness of the elephant represents the dullness of the mind, and eventually what you develop is a sense of clarity. I've heard that word being thrown around a bunch. And so, again, this is a concept you hear thrown out there like clarity. Well, that makes sense, sure, clarity. But what does clarity mean? That's the kind of question I like to ask. And so we draw from this Buddhist model, and we try to understand, well, how do we define, operationalize clarity? Is that just a phenomenal intensity in which we experience everything, the world? Or is it just about, actually, just be able to see correctly? I can, without my glasses, I can see somewhat, but it's more clarity when I put my glasses on. So what is clarity? So we try to operationalize it a little bit more. But clearly the Buddhists have their own sort of epistemology of what clarity means. And so we can draw from that. And that's why it's really important that we reflect on some of these practices from the Buddhist perspective. Because yes, Buddhism doesn't own it, but they have spent 2,600 years developing it. So we should look there just for some insight. Okay, so then there's fire. Fire represents effort. In the beginning, it's hard to sit with your own thoughts. Very difficult. We all know that. You just sit this morning, just sitting in quiet. It's difficult. It sometimes brings up a lot of difficult emotions, right? Eventually, it gets easier. And what I want to emphasize here is that mindfulness in this context is really just this rope, in which the rope is a skill in which it's using to grab hold of the mind. So then you can turn inwards. Okay? That's from the Buddhist perspective. So here it's described really as a mental factor, one of many mental factors, one of four in this case, but it's described as really a state of meta-awareness. Meta meaning awareness of awareness. Okay, so it's the monitor. And I'll get back to that. And discernment. Daniel also talked about discernment. Discernment is residing in it's having the wisdom, getting to understand what is right and what is wrong, what is the proper behavior, what is the wrong, what is the incorrect behavior. There is a lot of wisdom in self-reflection. And there's a lot of emphasis in the literature these days about how bad self-reflection is, because it leads to rumination, we're not being present in the moment, we're being judgmental. But judgment is really key. It's what we do best as humans. And so I'm going to emphasize how important judgment is, actually. It's not good to always be judgmental because it will interfere with your task demands. So in that context, judgment may be bad. And if it's negatively oriented, it will also be bad. But judgment is good. It's what makes us human. Okay? So it's also, mindfulness is also related to other mental factors that arise through this type of practice of stabilizing the mind, which includes effort, which includes equanimity. People have talked a little bit about equanimity. Equanimity that is associated with freedom from desire or craving or clinging to the things that we want, and a freedom from discontent or pushing away the things that we do not want. And this presence of clearly knowing, sampajanya. And in most Buddhist contexts, you'll actually see sati sampajanya fused together because the wisdom is so important to the development of awareness. In fact, mindfulness is thought of as a factor for concentration in this eightfold path. And the eightfold path is really a way towards reducing suffering. But it's an ethical framework in which you should cultivate mindfulness. So it involves right view, right intention, right speech, right action, how to behave. MBSR does not do that. Okay? Most mindfulness-based interventions do not do that. If you ask John, he'll say it's supposed to work implicitly. Because the idea is the more you practice, the more you turn inwards, the more you will realize how important it is to reflect outwards and be more altruistic or pro-social. And develop and cultivate these relationships that Daniel was so eloquently describing. It's really inspirational thing. So here we are in the mindful revolution. How do we contextualize mindfulness in this context? Well, we know that there are lots of different corporations now that are attempting to bring in mindfulness into their human resources areas that they're cultivating wellness, because they see the value in improving absenteeism, okay, or just improving performance, improving job satisfaction. So we can't blame them for doing this. I mean, some of their programs are certain that I've seen are not quite that impressive. Others are certainly developing and they're getting more extensive. But what people always complain about is that they don't have the time, right? Nobody has the time to do this. And I think we were talking earlier about, would it be strange if somebody walked into your office and saw you just sitting there silently, not producing, right? Or there was a nice picture of the person cutting the saw, right? I think the Ron's talk was talking about they were using a saw to cut the tree down, and someone said you should stop and sharpen your saw if you want to cut down that tree faster. I don't have time to do that, but we really do have to take the time. We have to make that time. That's the effort component. Okay. But there are lots of corporations now, a lot of people just trying to create their own interventions that will work across different institutions. But we see it everywhere. We see it in education. Okay, this is one of the contexts that we're really focusing on here. We see it in healthcare. Doing mindfulness and compassion training for caregivers. And the hypothesis is here, well, if we train our caregivers, the outcomes in our patients will improve. And we see this. I mean, it's anecdotally we see this, right? So if you're trained to actually develop that. So what's the most important thing that you see in a therapeutic relationship? Daniel alluded to it. Rapport. I mean, if you're a clinician, rapport is the biggest thing you have to establish before any change is going to happen. And what's rapport? It's that intimacy, right? That's really critical. So I think people are starting to look at how training our healthcare providers are affecting outcomes of the patients. And the same in education. We're looking now, if you're going to integrate mindfulness into an educational context, that it's really important that you train the teachers, not just the students. That's really critical. And what we see actually, that you can't just take an 8-week MBI and give it to kids, after school, in an after-school program and expect to see big change. You can't. You won't. Okay? It happens, little micro doses, right? You give them a little exposure, it might change something, but it might change their intention or their motivation to do more. But really, when you start to see real outcomes, is when you see the integrated classrooms. Okay, we talked a little bit about the whole individual, but when you integrate, when the whole classroom is mindful classroom, every day there are meditation practices. It's incorporated into every structure in which you deliver a curriculum. And then you see real change. And we have some data from a study that was a 20-year retrospective study of kids exposed to mindfulness in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in a classroom like that. And that's where you start to see real differences. It's amazing, even 20 years later. So also, let's not forget, the Seattle Seahawks think that they won the Super Bowl because they practiced mindfulness and yoga, or meditation and yoga specifically. The military they've been receiving training pre-deployment and looking at whether that's helping reduce or increase resilience, right? So they don't come back all with post-traumatic stress disorder. And then if they do have post-traumatic stress disorder, then helping them afterwards as well. So you see it in every sector of society now, everywhere. Okay? And like I said, it is no longer an alternative. It is just good medicine. So here's John, and how does he define it? We all know this definition. Focusing attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now, this definition has been great for the field. It's been great for these mindfulness-based interventions, but it's been really bad in a laboratory setting. There's so much going on in that definition, and we've had so much trouble with this idea of being non-judgmental. We're all judgmental. When you hear people, one of my biggest pet peeves is when people say, "Don't judge me." I'm sorry, we're human. We judge. That's what we do. We evaluate. It's built into the structure of our prefrontal cortex to do that. But we can do so in more kind, compassionate ways, for sure, and use it for drawing wisdom. So I like to think of this as what we call maybe mindfulness induction. If we do this right now, okay, let's all spend 5 seconds paying attention in the present moment. Okay, you just did mindfulness. That's great. So now you can say you've done mindfulness no matter what. If this is your first exposure to mindfulness, congratulations. It's your first sort of doorway into doing mindfulness-based practices. So a lot of clinicians will say they do mindfulness, and they may do some level of this for various amounts of time, and that's okay. That's great. You know, every sort of moment is an opportunity to develop these skills. But when we interpret the science, that's my point is we have to be very clear as to what was actually done. And so when people do this, it's not exactly the same as sitting for a long period of time, where there's a lot more continuity in how you pay attention to your own thoughts and things that happen around you. Also, is there such thing as a mindful person? Trait mindfulness. Okay, this is something that's more enduring. You don't ever have to meditate, but you can still score high on a trait mindfulness score. We have over 8 measures now, at least 8, and I heard another one today, so that's, this was on self-care, but there was some element of mindfulness there. And these measures have been great to try to capture what John created in that definition, focusing attention in a particular way. But a lot of times what we find is that these statistical properties of these measures, well, they suggest that there's a common factor of mindfulness. And there's some evidence that this is not the case, actually, that many of these measures don't even correlate with each other. There's one study that I like to point out a lot that uses one of these measures and shows that college-age students who abuse alcohol score more highly on mindfulness than long-term practitioners. Well, so does this really accurately reflect what mindfulness is then? That's a problem, okay? It's a problem when you interpret a study that was published, and then the media picks it up and says, oh, look, people with high levels of mindfulness are really bad at learning. How did they do that study? Did they use just a self-report measure? Or was there some other correlation? The best metric we have right now, and it's not the best, but it's what we use, and it's certainly better than self-report, because often practice time doesn't even correlate with self-report. That's also a problem. But practice time has a little bit better reflection of outcomes. You see a lot better correlations with outcomes with practice time. So the more someone actually practices, and you can actually quantify that, the more likely you will see outcomes. Okay, so just like any skill, right? When you practice, the better you get. Okay, so as an intervention, the standard that we have out there is this sort of prescription. 26 hours, 8 weekly group classes, 2.5 hours a class, 1 all-day class, home practice 45 minutes a day, 36 hours over 8 weeks, 3 very specific practices, focused attention, usually on the breath. It could be really on anything. Open monitoring, meditation that involves also body scan, insight, or vipassana type practice. Some sort of loving kindness or compassion-based practice, and some light hatha yoga. Now, there's certainly variations of this out there, and no one has actually systematically studied variations in session time with outcomes, but there have been outcomes with effect sizes greater than 1 that have been reported with as little as 6 hours of class time. So, what does that mean? And what does it mean when we're seeing sort of brief interventions that are some that don't do the 8 weeks, maybe some just do 3 days, some do 4 20-minute sessions, for example. Point being is that this is the standard, and when we do research, we have to have a standard. Okay, there has to be standards. I mean, it's great that we're all trying to create our own programs, and I totally encourage that because that's helping people immediately. We know what works intuitively. If you're a practitioner, you know. But at the same time, we do have to create some standards. So as the research continues, we will have more standards in which we can test. Now, we know there are brief interventions that can be 3 days, that work, that have outcomes. So I think we're slowly adapting this model, but from the NIH's perspective, if you don't do this, then you're not doing mindfulness. Okay, so when a lot of people, apply for a grant, and someone like myself reviews it, for example, I look for at least some sort of fidelity, and so does the NIH, for that matter. They want to know fidelity, meaning this is reproducible, right? It's just standards of practice for research. But as we continue, if you feel like your particular intervention is impactful, create a manual, as much as we hate to, and then we can continue to test it as a standard. So there are many of the core teachings have now been rooted in some of the best evidence-based interventions, MBSR being the standard model, the most fidelity, and MBCT being very specific for a very specific form of depression. So this is not just for any old person with depression. This is for somebody who goes to their primary care doctor and says, I've had 2 or 3 times, I've had some episodes of depression. I'm fine now. I just don't want it to come back. MBCT. That's the standard, at least it's been used for in the case of depression. It's now changing. In the last few years, now they're finding that MBCT actually can help people with acute depression. That's great. So it's great that it's being applied elsewhere, but the standard sticks with preventing relapse. There's acceptance commitment therapy, also a great evidence-based model. This is the third wave approach that somebody mentioned also. The dialectical behavior therapy, a little bit less rigorous. This involves a little bit more of the mindfulness induction techniques referred to, Marshall Linehan's work. And there are some other therapies that are emerging, like the emotion regulation therapy that has some mix of mindfulness-based practices. But really, only the top 2 have the standard model. Okay, those 8-week courses with those very specific practices of meditation, formalized. We call that mindfulness with the big N. Okay, formal mindfulness practice. Of course, there's also the problem in research of informal practice. Okay, what happens when you're in traffic, someone cuts you off, and you kick in your mindfulness gear, and suddenly you're like, I'm feeling a little angry. I'm going to just come back to baseline now and let them go on. Bye-bye. That's informal practice. You did something, sort of mindfully, and you had awareness of your own reactivity. You should pat yourself on the back during that time and be like, I just did some mindfulness. Because the informal practice is really important as well. And it's hard to measure though. Okay, so the other way mindfulness is usually described as a form of meditation. You say, I practice mindfulness meditation. Well, what does that really mean? It means most likely that you're practicing what we refer to as open monitoring meditation, which is a diffuse attention towards any mental objects that naturally arise. There's no focus of your attention on any one object. It's to anything that arises. And it's a much more difficult practice, especially for a beginner. And that's why you saw in the beginning the stages of shamatha. He starts with focused attention. You start with the breath. And that helps stabilize attention. That's usually the best place to start. So, accepting that mindfulness practice affects multiple systems across the mind, brain, and body, David Silberswag and I focused on creating a model that accounted for all systems and the underlying mechanisms by which mindfulness may be working. But really as a method, a systematic method of mental training, okay, that involves very core meditation practices. And so I have this picture of a brain working out here, not to really say anything except for emphasize that we can think of these techniques as a form of mental training, right? We're just strengthening the mental muscle, so to speak. Just like you go to the gym to practice, to build up your physical muscles. You're really doing these practices to stabilize attention, right? Some of that is really considered a form of mental training. And the very core practices And it's supposed to really transform the self across multiple domains, multiple systems. So we focus on the self when we look at how you can have increased awareness, okay, of your own mental habits and decreased biases. So self-awareness is the first sort of component in this model. The ability to regulate yourself through impulse management, just like in the picture on the Tonka, taking control of the elephant. And lastly, the most important part, which was emphasized again by David, this self-transcendence component. Developing a positive relationship between self and other that transcends self-focused needs and increases pro-social behavior. What I mean by that is really just whatever Daniel said. Creating that connection, that human connection. That's so critical. And the reason why I have a picture of a mother and a child is it's actually used in the Buddhist literature to depict the unconditional love that a mother has for their child. Okay, that unconditional love is really powerful. Now imagine if you can cultivate that kind of love and compassion to everyone around you. Okay? Again, this exercise was demonstrated nicely by Daniel in the beginning. And even with the two groups that were going to give money to whether or not to give them to each other. If it was your mother, maybe you would. In some cases, maybe you wouldn't. But if you had this unconditional love for that person, you certainly would, right? So that's what we're talking about. This is the foundation of the practice. However, we often focus on these two because they're the ones that get us ahead, right? They get us to perform better. They decrease our stress. So we have these models are all described, and probably these are the two best papers that we have to describe the models by which we create a framework for understanding how mindfulness works. And we've done this with yoga as well, so you can see in those models. And then we also created a mindfulness research collaborative with our group. Many of us in the Boston area, including Carl, we're somewhere out there, Carl. Yeah, there's Carl. We've been meeting regularly for probably the last, 10 years. And, we create papers together. And we're collaborative in the sense that no one's first author here. Okay? We're all equal authors. And I think that's a model also that we're trying to encourage people to work collaboratively. That, in this case, we've been very productive. We put out really good position papers. And now we have one of the largest grants given by the NIH to do dismantle mindfulness-based interventions. There's 12 of us, 12 co-authors. And we have $5 million to help try and understand how mindfulness relates to behavioral change. Okay, so there are core practices that I want to focus on. Focused attention, meditation, which is a single-pointed object, for example, the breath, but it could be anything. So this is really a general sort of typology of meditation, but in the context of mindfulness, there are very specific practices. So focused attention implies that you're focusing on the breath. Open monitoring is a diffuse attention towards anything that arises, the same as shikantaza and Zen, or choiceless awareness by Krishnamurti, or vipassana. Ethical enhancement practice, which is loving kindness, metta. Forgiveness is another adaptation. Compassion, some sort of practice that encourages that connection, human connection, right? And then movement-based practices. So this can be yoga, tai chi, or qigong. So here are the core practices. If you want to create an intervention, throw these in there, and then have your own practice. Because one thing that I've taken from John, having conversations with John Kabat-Zinn, is that he'll always say, if you want to create something, if you want to create a program, an intervention, don't just try to find an MBSR curriculum off the shelf and use that. That's one of the reasons he didn't create a manual. Because he thinks it's most important that you have your own practice. And if you embody the practice, then you will have an effect on outcomes. It's really about how you carry yourself. And as you as the clinician, as the educator, as you carry yourself. And if you create it, they will come. Okay, so those are the core practices. So we've created models that describe the cognitive and neurobiological processes and substrates that are supporting what's happening while we practice. And I don't have time to go into all of them, but I'm going to focus on just one. But sort of the end result of making these models is that we sort of outline very specific neurocognitive skills that are affected by doing these practices and that help facilitate self-awareness, regulation, and transcendence. So we have, of course, intention and motivation is one of the most important parts. And intention and motivation can change. If somebody starts to do a practice because they have a little stress in their lives or that their doctor said that they should, that's fine, right? That could change. Maybe they will actually want to help humanity more as they continue to practice, or maybe they will try to strive for enlightenment, whatever they want to call enlightenment. Attention regulation. So this is probably one of the critical aspects of the practice, and I will say that there is not really a lot of good research supporting that attention is actually changed through meditation practice. I'll show you the best data point that we have for that, but it's not a lot. Sorry. Emotion regulation. Can we inhibit our responses and can we develop equanimity? How fast can we come back to baseline? It's not about suppressing our emotion. Get angry. That's great. If somebody does something wrong to you, fine, get angry. Have anger for the act, but for compassion for the actor. Anger for the action, not the actor. There's a critical difference. Right? And equanimity means come back to your baseline quickly and move on with your day. Don't let it stick in your head all day and get you all riled up. That's real. So recovery is key in emotion regulation. Extinction and reconsolidation. This is really about changing habits of mind, and replacing maladaptive habits with adaptive habits. Because we all have habits, we all have biases. Some are psychopathological, some are not, but we all have them, and we can certainly improve them. All of us can. Prosociality. So developing skills for altruistic behavior, like empathy. We can develop empathy, develop an ability to step into other people's shoes. And this is really important in an ethical framework. And then lastly, meta-awareness. So this is where we start to see changes in the ability to have this form of psychological distancing. Someone was also referring to this in the last panel, is not that you get caught up in your feelings, right? I'm not angry. I'm someone who's having a thought of anger. That distance is really healthy, and it allows us to see things from this decentered perspective. Okay, so let me just walk you through one of these models. This will be focused attention. So we start a model by showing a framework of motor learning. And this form of conditioning refers to developing a skill like riding a bike or learning a musical instrument. You just get better through practice, right? And as you continue to do it, effort will decrease. And that means you will actually see a lot of activity in basal ganglia or parts of your circuitry in your brain responsible for skill-based learning. Okay? It's making your brain more efficient. That's what it's. Any skill that you learn is always going to be trying to put things into automatic pilot. But automatic pilot in the sense that it's doing a good habit. You can have good automatic pilot too. You don't have to have automatic pilot that's always bad. Automatic pilot can be helpful because it improves your efficiency of your brain. Okay? So then we start with intention. What is your intention? Well, we've been talking about how important intention is and motivation. It's really important for goal setting. Okay, that's a very higher order cognitive process. What do you want out of this? Do you want just a little stress reduction, or do you want to, change humanity? So then you learn the instructions, what you're supposed to do while you're practicing. Also referred to as form and set. It's an executive function. You have to keep those instructions in your mind using working memory. You focus your attention. It says on the breath, right? So this, we can look at the distinction between alerting and orienting of your body, how you actually pay attention to objects before you even have awareness. Okay, what we realize is that these early forms of attentional processing are key. This is where a lot of avoidance, you see a lot of avoidance already at the level of underneath awareness, and you can measure this. There are very specific tasks that you can use to measure alerting and orienting, where there's not even awareness. Okay? And what you see a lot in anxiety and in chronic pain is a hypervigilant avoidant model, where you see they're very sensitive, their perceptual systems are very sensitive to pain-related words or anxious-related content. They detect it, and then they look away, they avoid. That's their emotion regulation strategy. It works, but it's not very adaptive. So then you engage on the object, which is the breath, right? And you have to monitor it. Monitor the breath. It seems relatively easy to do, but as all of you know who's tried to do this, it's kind of difficult to do for a long time. But this is what helps stabilize the mind. So now I'm going to show you pictures of the brain. Don't get scared if you don't have a neuroscience background. Again, like I said, we have colors. Everything's color-coded. Okay? But these are based on real brain networks. Okay, so we have 4 networks of the brain, and I'm going to just briefly touch upon what these networks do. The blue network, this is very early, this is what's happening underneath the hood, so to speak. Okay? This is early forms of conditioning, action tendencies. It's helping orient your body in space, in time. It's what you're conditioned to do. Okay? It's early forms of attentional processing. So it involves things like supplementary motor areas and parts of your parietal lobe. I'm just going to leave it at that. That's your blue network. Okay? Your yellow network is the sensory in the moment network. It's what's happening right now. Experience how your body feels, what sounds are coming in, feelings that you're having, okay, right now. And that involves some working memory without evaluation. This is where the non-judgment comes in, right? The present moment. Then you have the green network. The green network is really important for your narrative, constructing your self-narrative, where you are in time and space, who you are, okay? That's really important. We all have to have a sense of identity, right? We just don't want to get stuck there. So a lot of times we get stuck. And 50% of our lives, there's a great study that showed by Dan Gilbert and Matt Killingsworth, that showed that half of our lives are spent in this green network, ruminating about ourselves in the past or worrying or fantasizing in the future. Right? 50% of our lives, no matter what we're doing, we're always distracted by their self-narrative. And unfortunately, it typically leads to unhappiness. But the green network is also really important for creative incubation, okay? For goal setting, and just for creating a sense of self. We need to have some sense of self. This is where we draw from our narrative to create wisdom, what from our experience of what was right, what was wrong, what worked, what didn't. Okay, we draw from there, but we don't sit there, we don't reside there. But lastly is this orange network, okay? And I'm going to focus on one particular region of it. It's frontal polar cortex, which is this part here. It's right behind your forehead, okay? That network is really important. It's a higher order cognitive network that's really important for flexibly switching between the other networks. It actually has awareness. Okay? It's where your meta-awareness is coming from. It's being able to know when you're in the narrative and to decouple, right? To know when you're paying attention to the present moment and then switch at will. Okay? That network is very critical, as you'll see from the literature, that's one that's growing and it's being strengthened a lot through meditation practice. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that these processes are mapped out on this model. What networks are active during this part of the practice. Okay? So then, of course, we lose focus, we're distracted. Maybe you are there right now. You're focusing on something other than what you're seeing. You're thinking about other things. You know, oh, I'm bored. What am I going to do later? Okay, this is our habitual place of comfort. It's a comfort network. Our self-narrative. So this is rumination, mental proliferation. This is one thought leads to another thought, and another thought, and so on, and we get stuck. How do we get back to where we're supposed to be? The most critical, this is the green network again, guys. So green network is the narrative, right? Green network narrative, yellow is sensory, orange is meta, blue is preconscious sort of motor, okay? So we get stuck there. The most important part of practice is how do you get out of that state? How do you recognize that I'm ruminating? Well, it's really up to the monitor to kick in. And the idea is the more you practice, the better the monitor gets at detecting that it's in the narrative. And then you have this experience of decentering, inhibiting your responses, regulating your emotions, okay? And disengaging from the stickiness, okay, that we always talk about in practice, on a thought, on a feeling, the stickiness. That you're deeply engaged. You're so engaged that you don't see anything else around you. And I'll show you evidence for that. Okay? So you have to disengage, and that means strengthening the monitor. And then you develop equanimity and some clarity. We can talk about what those mean operationally. But again, orange network, really important for inhibiting impulses. For the monitor, the disengagement is really critical. The blue network. Okay. Again, here's your network. This is all available in those publications too. Okay. So let me just take a step back, and literally step back. And I want to focus on the frontal polar cortex for a minute, okay? So what's so interesting about this brain region? It's implicated in a range of activities, including meta-awareness, including remembering to carry out intended activities, otherwise referred to as prospective memory, anticipating the future, multitasking, switching between externally versus internally oriented thoughts. That's one of the key aspects of the practice. It gives you the skill to switch between external world and internal world, and to know where you're at. Okay, this brain region is really important for that, as this study pointed out. Selectively mediating the human ability to hold in mind goals while exploring and processing secondary goals. This is really important for planning and reasoning. So there's definitely an adaptive advantage of this prefrontal cortex, and we can explore a little bit more of what else it's been shown to do. It's been shown to be one of the most critical parts of our brain for us, enabling us to attend to a novel degree, either to the environmental stimuli or to self-generated thoughts. That's what I just said, the thoughts in our head, right? So, but we can look even further back, sort of in the field of paleoneurology or comparative neuroanatomy, and what you start to see is some real stark differences or changes in the earliest hominid ancestors. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, the Australopithecus started to walk upright, started to remember where they stored their food, and would then, instead of being opportunistic, they'd actually go to very specific places to get their food. And what they found was that it was the prefrontal cortex, the frontal polar cortex specifically, that dramatically reorganized. So much so that they're able to now use language, tools, create fire to cook their food. Now if we look at a closer look, you'll see that the relative volume, okay, so it's really just the percentage of the whole brain size of 4 brain regions were looked at across other primates. The closest non-human primate is the bonobo. And what they found is that the relative size of the human frontal polar cortex, otherwise known as Brodmann area 10, is twice that of both bonobos and chimpanzees. So you see this really large difference, okay, in the size of that particular structure relative to other parts of the brain. And interestingly, there's this spacing that you see. There's a lot more space in that area between the synaptic boutons. Or so the way neurons work is you have a long axon, and then you have these little dendrites that come off of the cell that connect to other cells. And so what you find here is that there's a lot more space for synapses to be made. So there's a huge, what they call a horizontal spacing distance between all of the synaptic terminals. Much more so in this brain region than in humans, relative to any other part of the human brain, and in comparison to all other other non-human primates. So there's something really interesting that happened in this particular brain region that allows us to have this very unique ability to be meta-aware and for higher order cognition. It's 30% greater in that frontal pole than any other brain region. Okay, so let me try to sum up in the last few minutes of where the research is and how it supports these models. I'm going to give you one data point on attention. I think that one of the best models of how meditation affects our attentional processing. I'm assuming that some of you have not heard of the attentional blink task, so I'm going to describe it very quickly. The way it works is you have a set of, in this case, letters, and you have that are separated, so there's about 15 or 19 items. Each one is presented for about 50 milliseconds, and then your goal is to identify two target numbers that are at T1 and T2. And they are separated by a certain amount of time, either 336 milliseconds or 672 milliseconds in this case. And the way this works is that most people, when they report seeing the first number and it's less, and then the second number comes 500 milliseconds or less later, they blink attentionally. They don't report seeing it. Okay, it's kind of subliminal, right? So interesting, I guess, right? But meditators just have a better ability to detect the second object, the second number, if it's within that 500 millisecond time period. So why is that? Right? So again, just to be clear, okay, so this was in short intervals, so below 500 milliseconds. Their accuracy at reporting the second number was a lot better in practitioners than this was actually time 1, time 2. So what happened is that they just got better more rapidly. They learned faster. They didn't really know the task, but they learned much faster than the controls. But what I really want to emphasize here is the brain, what happens in the brain. So let me just walk you through this. So you have what's called this attentional sort of response or invoked response potential or event-related potential to each number. Okay, T1 at T1 and T2. And what you see for the practitioners is a decrease in amplitude. So this is the red line, okay, versus time 1. The red line. And what you see is a decrease in amplitude in their response to the first object, implying that their efficiency in which they are dedicating resources to detecting an object is much better. But they're not putting all their resources into naming an object, and then everything else disappears. There's some resources left over. They're just more efficient at processing the world without dedicating all your resources to it. Does that make sense? I see some nodding heads. Okay, good. If it doesn't scream right now. I'll try better. Again, the point here is that practitioners, the more meditation practice they had, was the more accurate they were at detecting that second object. And there's a real, hard basic science sort of explanation for that. And again, this sort of speaks to the stickiness. So if you were stuck on just even detecting an object, like your attention just engages with something and you don't disengage quickly, then you're not going to detect that second object. But if you're able to disengage quickly, then you're more efficient with your processing. All right, so now, as of today, there's been 21 neuroimaging studies that are decent quality that look at the morphological changes in the brain due to very specific mindfulness-based meditations. Okay? There was a nice review done by Kieran Fox, coming out of Kalina Christoph's lab. This involved over 300 meditation practitioners, and what they found, I'm going to tell you in a minute. There's also a smaller meta-analysis done by Sperduti et al., looking at functional changes in the brain. And actually, the Christoph lab just recently put out a meta-analysis on all the functional studies that we have today. There are 78, actually there's about 80 neuroimaging studies as of today on that are, well, 80 neuroimaging studies, fMRI, PET, all different SPECT, all different modalities of different types of meditation practices. Of those 80, about 26, 27 were good enough to be put into a meta-analysis. And this paper also describes some of the brain-related changes due to meditation. And this is across types of meditation. So I'm going to summarize what they found. So out of all these studies, what you see is a change in morphological size, the structure of the actual, the size of the brain region increases in size. And there are a lot of implications for what this means. For various reasons, brain structures grow, different, not gray matter, you're not actually growing new neurons. Unfortunately, all of our gray matter is declining after a second decade of life. We'll talk about that in a second too. But you have increased synaptic connections, and that's what's going to be reflective in these changes in size. So you see a change in size in the frontal polar cortex. Remember, we just talked about how important that area is. Your dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So both of those are really important for the orange network, okay? The meta network, the meta awareness, right? Inferior temporal gyrus is also important. That seems to be important because it's changing in size. It's less clear exactly how it's involved, but it's part of the yellow network, or the sensory awareness network. And so are your sensory motor regions. You see those change in size too. You're just more aware of what's happening, okay? And also the insula. The insula is one of the most fascinating brain regions because it represents your entire viscera of your body is represented in your insula. And there's a lot of awareness of body, of space, and relation to others in the insula. It's a good region to focus on because it's involving both the meta and the experiential network. And your hippocampus changes in size too. Of course, that's the only place in your brain where there's neurogenesis, by the way. But it's going to grow in size whether you learn any skill. So those are the areas that are changing in size. In terms of function, you see the same types of activity in those brain regions. I mean, if you flex that muscle, it will grow. But also you see changes in the caudate. Okay? Caudate is a part of your brain, the blue network, really important for habits, for skills. Okay, you learn to ride a bike, you're engaging the caudate. You learn to ride, learn meditation, you're engaging the caudate. And part of the parahippocampal area. And what's decreasing is part of the green network. You see decreased activation in part of the narrative self. That makes sense too, right? So there have been studies now by Judd Brewer's lab, for example. There's Judd's lab doing some neurofeedback, focusing on decreasing targeting the posterior cingulate cortex and modulating it to enhance practice. Okay, so that's happening, and that's working well. Now I just want to give you a few data points on aging. Like I said, our brains unfortunately are atrophying after the second decade of life. And the only way to stop that apparently is, one way to stop it is apparently meditation. So that's been shown. One of Sarah Lazar's first studies that she reported in 2005 showed that both the insula and the frontal polar cortex changes in size. But what I wanted to point out here was that there was this negative correlation here with age and atrophy of those brain regions. But in meditators, okay, the blue circles, that atrophy didn't happen, especially in the frontal polar cortex. So the frontal polar cortex seems to be preserved from atrophy in the meditators. Very interesting. You see also similar type of conservation of the atrophy in the putamen, also part of the blue network. Okay, meditators have this actually positive correlation. It was actually increasing in size compared to the controls where it was decreasing, okay, atrophying. Everyone's brain is atrophying after 20 years old. And then a larger study
Not according
looked
to the
at tons of
Chinese.
meditators, all different from all walks of life, and found just different clusters across all different networks were not atrophying as rapidly as controls. So again, just more evidence that the meditation practice is conserving a lot of the brain from deteriorated. Okay, so a few neuroendocrine data points. I wanted to just emphasize that in this case, this is a compassion-based practice. This is a cognitively based compassion training coming out of a Tibetan tradition of Lojong. And they found that a marker of inflammation is decreasing, and the more practice that they did, the more that the inflammatory marker decreased in the periphery of your blood. Okay? Inflammation is a big marker now for mental disease and all types of disease. Okay? So we see inflammation being preserved also in another study done by Richie Davidson's lab, looking at MBSR versus a very active control matched for everything you can imagine. The MBSR group had decreases in the TNF alpha and IL-6, other markers of inflammation. Okay, so again, inflammatory markers are good indicators of disease states. In this case, all I want to do is point out one thing here, is that this is, so I was telling Daniel, the most stressful thing for a human to do is to get up on a stage in front of bright lights and give a public talk. It just happens to be. And so we do in a laboratory setting, we do what's called the Trier social stress test. We put someone up in front of a bunch of people with white lab coats and clipboards and lights, and then you measure their stress and look at cortisol. And so you do this with meditators, and what you see is that, for example, two things. One, the inflammation doesn't go as high in longer-term practitioners. Okay, you see less inflammation during the not only on the onset of the talk, but then afterwards it doesn't increase as steadily or as high in magnitude. And then in cortisol, this is, I think, the key point when I was talking about equanimity, that the recovery of cortisol. So cortisol goes up, stress goes up. It's going to be stressful, right? But how quickly can you recover? That's the key. In this case, they recovered faster. So recovery of stress hormones faster. All right. I'm not, for sake of time, I'm not going to get into telomeres, but I will show that. So telomeres are a really interesting story. It's really an indicator of aging. They're protective DNA sequences and our chromosomes. And there are basically some initial data by Alyssa Eppel showing that telomere length can be influenced by meditative practice. And I would just suggest that you check her work out. It's focusing on there. So I'm going to spend just one more minute, or 2 minutes, talking about just the future. What do we have to do? Well, the past, 1963, was probably the first study ever done on meditation that was published in peer review. It was about, let's see if I can show you they basically just had someone stare at a vase for a long period of time. That was the first study. So I really wanted to just say, it's been about 50 years since they've done this, right? 50 or 60 years. That's where we've come from, okay? It's not a long time, really, in terms of how we've progressed, right? And they really talked about just stability of attention, decreasing distraction, enhancing vividness, perceptual clarity. That's what we saw in 1963. So where are we going? Well, we need to test these mechanisms, okay? That's what the NIH is asking, very specifically. Test the mechanisms. Okay, we take any of those mechanisms that I showed you and say, okay, I want to look at meta-awareness. I have a task that will increase meta-awareness, and I want to see it, or we'll test meta-awareness, and we'll see if by doing your intervention, I'll increase meta-awareness. Boom, there you go. You tested a mechanism. Right, so you have all these different mechanisms in which you can test. So develop a task, find a task, talk to someone who has a task, and then use it, right? And that's what the NIH is looking for right now. Optimizing the mindful space intervention. They also want us to improve mindful space interventions. Do we really need to read Rumi for a mindful space intervention? You do it in MBSR. You read a Rumi poem. How critical is reading Rumi? I don't know. Let's find out. Okay? So they want to know if you take out certain things or put in other things, can you boost a particular mechanism that you strategize as being critical? So mindful space intervention. Can we figure out dose? Can we figure out which populations are going to benefit, which won't? We need to know these answers. And then taking the Buddhist concepts, because they're helpful, because they're 2,600 years older than us, in terms of how we understand the mind, and trying to operationalize some of these concepts like equanimity and clarity. What does it mean? Okay? What does it mean to be, to have clarity? Or wisdom, even. Right? And then neurophenomenology. I want to really emphasize a take on using first-person approaches, asking people what they're experiencing, qualitative research, in conjunction with more objective measures. That's really critical. Okay? Because we can't just rely on third-person types of science. And then dissociating types of meditation practice. So if you're going to do a very specific form of practice, well then study it. Okay? See what it can do. Okay, figuring out how, if you just put all of that together and then add like a nutrition course, a cooking class, a really great social network, and a running club, and a book reading thing, it's going to help people. But how do you know what's the active ingredients? What's having the effect? We need to know that. Okay, so lastly, we're going to continue mapping the brain across the spectrum of experience. And we need to know from novice, from 4 20-minute sessions, or from our mindfulness induction we did today, to long-term practitioners, what's happening in the brain. We're going to continue doing that. It's an initiative in our lab. We'll continue doing that for diagnostic purposes, as a way to navigate progress of the practitioner, as a target for therapy. Because now we're doing neurofeedback, so it's specifically aiming at very specific targets that are helping us reduce distraction and improve well-being. And we have to at least keep in mind that there's a difference between a mindfulness induction and a long-term practice retreat. I'll just read this to you. This is a guy on his cell phone saying, "Can I call you back yet? I'm in the moment here." And you have these guys saying, "Oh, master, is it proper for a monk to use email?" And the master says, "Sure, as long as there are no attachments." So, again, goals, context, content, and process. Be very clear when you're doing this research about outlining what those are and how they differ. So, just to conclude, so sorry that it took over time now. Mindfulness can be conceptualized in different ways at different goals, context, content, and process. There are core practices that are conceptualized as a form of systematic mental training that improves self-awareness, regulation, and transcendence, underlying neurocognitive processes. There are very specific mechanisms that we outlined. I gave you a few salient points. Decreased activity in brain regions responsible for mind wandering, right? Increased activity and size in brain areas responsible for higher order attention, body awareness, and skill learning. Improved recovery and resilience from stress, including biomarkers of immune function and cellular longevity. Thanks to our lab. I couldn't do this without the support of the Functional Neuroimaging Lab. David Sobersweiss, the chair of psychiatry, is really interested in trying to boost an initiative at the Brigham at the institutional level. We work with, I highly recommend working with contemplative practitioners who do this for a living, just teach meditation. Really having good meditation practitioners on a team and research is critical. And thank you all for listening and your patience. Thank you so much. I've been informed we have 5 minutes for questions. She's been exploring the attentional blink in her lab.
Hello? There we go. All right. I'm Melissa Brown from the College of Rockport. We are looking at dispositional mindfulness right now because we don't have meditators And we're getting ready to look at the attentional blink, and we have this idea that like, because if you meditate or if you're high in this positional mindfulness, you have the ability to disengage efficiently from stimuli, that would affect time perception.
What perception?
Time perception.
Time perception.
And I'm throwing this out. Are we crazy or what is it? We're thinking about it in terms
Yes,
of
I would agree.
impulsivity.
I think so. So Daniel was saying, about surgeons like who feel like time is expanding when they're. Is it you? Or wasn't you? Who's saying that? Ron was saying that. Slowing down, right? The feeling of slowing down when their surgeons are in their they're in the moment or in the zone, so to speak, right? So I would say yes. There's something to do that you would have to really control for arousal, because arousal is going to be a factor that's going to contribute. But yeah, people report this. The idea is that if you're clearing up space here in your cognitive, part of your brain, to sort of pay attention to what's happening around you, by putting the things that you're typically ruminating on in the background, then you're able to engage and disengage with objects very quickly, like multitasking, really, because you're switching. Then yes, time would change. Your perception of time would change.
Is anybody looking at this besides us?
There are some people, yes. I'm not sure his name, but email me and I will certainly hook you up.
All right, great, thank you.
We have one over here, this side of the room.
I'm wondering if you would make a distinction between mindfulness and meditation, given that I think you can almost have to draw a distinction between mind and consciousness.
Yeah.
And so if you also draw the distinction between intentional consciousness and non-intentional consciousness, then if meditation proper is a matter of non-intentional consciousness, or what I would call immanent transcendence, then doesn't this present a problem to the operationalization of meditation?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by immanent transcendence, but I can say that...
Well, what I mean is when you refer to self-awareness, that refers to consciousness being aware of itself as consciousness.
Okay.
It's kind of like the distinction between the approach of the Vedanta and a Buddhist approach.
Yeah. So Tulving, one of our great memory researchers, described this aspect of knowing, of knowing your own consciousness, autonoetic consciousness. And so, for example, you can make a comparison between mind wandering, where you have multiple objects that are passing by your mental space, and you're just not aware that it's happening, right? Or it's interfering with your ongoing task. That we call rumination, right? But if you have the same mental objects, and this is the case I'm trying to make, so if the same mental objects are passing by your mental space, but you're aware of them, then it's meditation. It's a subtle difference, but there is just a difference in awareness and intention too, of course, what you're going to do with that information. Follow it, engage on it, or just let it pass. So those are the subtle differences, the meta-awareness and the intentionality behind what you do with that content.
But then you're defining awareness or consciousness always with reference to the object and not with reference to itself.
In this case, I am defining awareness as reference to an object, yes. But so in terms of transcendence, so this non-dual state of consciousness that you may be referring to, that develops over time in practice, where you dissolve the distinction between subject and object, is a very high-level experience that some people refer to as a form of awakening, or even Kensho and Zen, or something like that. People have studied this non-dual perspective, or change, or experience. We're still trying to understand how it differs, but what it seems like is just a dissolution of self. And the self-object distinction is there. There is no distinction between self and other anymore, okay? But it's a very high-level state of awareness. And so we're still, I think,
Yeah, I just think maybe preserving the distinction ontologically is important, Because even though you can measure,
Oh, it's absolutely preserved.
yes, variations in consciousness,
We make that
if it gets defined, if mindfulness gets defined reductively, then big pharma may as well come in and find a pill for it.
Yeah, well, like I said, there's no good authoritative definition of mindfulness today. No one agrees, even the schools of Buddhism don't agree on what mindfulness is and is not. But there are various ways of describing it. The easiest one is the state of awareness. But anyway, we can talk more about that.
In regard to trait mindfulness, or even when somebody's had enough experience that you've seen brain changes or greater brain volume, would you, do you believe that that's like a cognitive reserve or brain reserve? I mean, it seems like it is in aging, but is it the same kind of principle where that's protecting you? So say you have disease burden from Alzheimer's
Yeah.
disease, would it?
That's one way to look at it, and it's a good empirical question. You should test it.
I'd like to.
But the point I think you're also getting at is, so do some people karmically come to this world, to this reality with a higher level of awareness than others? Maybe. Or just at least are in a better place to experience this non-dual perspective than others. And I would say if you believe in sort of a staged model of ego development or self-development, some people are still in this sort of Maslow stage of physiological needs, and you just have to deal with where they're at. They're not ready for self-actualization, right? So you have to deal. If they have, severe depression or trauma, don't expect them to be residing in the state of non-dual awareness and experiencing the bliss of that. Work where they're at. And so there is sort of this trait or sort of disposition that people come with to the practice. Some people are ready to experience that bliss and can experience it, after one Dharma talk. Boom, they're experiencing this awakened state. But other people, it can take lifetimes. At least that's the way that Alan
Yeah,
Watts
it's an
likes to
interesting question about whether that's differences in the brain,
the brain.
or is it a difference in...
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I don't think we have the answer at this point because we're lumpers. We don't look at science at an individual level yet. At this point, we take everybody with certain characteristics and we lump them together and we look at the nice average what it looks like. But your point is well taken. We need to really think about individualized therapy and looking at individuals in terms of differences.
We're about 10 minutes over. Maybe have room for one more question. And this is up for a while.
I keep going until someone says stop.
I just wanted to say that, first of all, it's wonderful that you're all here. I'm a law professor here at SUNY Buffalo. My name is Rebecca French, and for the last 30 years I've worked on law and Buddhism and meditation. So I spent 4 years at the Dalai Lama and things like that, and I've written on it, just finished a book on Buddhism and law. But I want you to think just a little bit about how what you're working on also has these huge social implications. I mean, the Buddha wrote an entire law code called the Vidya, to do nothing, produce this in society. We're starting a journal here at SUNY Buffalo called Buddhism, Law, and Society, and publishing on nothing but this, the ideas that he came up to regulate social systems as well as individual mental practices. So we're doing it in all different ways, is what I wanted to say. Yeah, it's very exciting. Long haul, convincing lawyers. That's a good idea. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you everybody so much.
Hey,